Robert Sharpe is the founder of byte and host of the Bringing Inspiration to Earth radio show, on which I had the pleasure of appearing not long ago. Robert's also the author of 3 books that are based around the themes of spirituality, caring and joy. I had the chance recently to talk with him about these topics and his books and more, and share with you now some of his delightful insights. Tell us about yourself.
Well, boy, that's a loaded question. Well, let's see. I started as a corporate person, and in training, and much of my work there was, creating tools and aids for workers to make their jobs easier. And so, and then after that, I did an entrepreneurial kind of path, and in each case, it seemed that my passion and my path is one of bringing ideas into reality, and that was in the corporate world. And then when I moved into the doing the podcast and an author, it was basically taking ideas, bringing inspiration to earth. It was taking ideas and making them physical.
So would you describe yourself as having had a spiritual awakening? I suppose that's the way we describe it, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say that it's developed, over time. Initially, my kind of interest in the spiritual and metaphysical realm was purely personal. I had some tarot cards. I would read, for myself and try, and that was it. I rarely went to people to get readings, and I rarely, kind of followed up on kind of what was the in thing at the time, and that was probably from the 1980s on. And so throughout the period from that point, to being able to talk about it, to people, it shifted. And with the radio show that I've now done for starting 13 years, I've become more open to possibilities, open to just learning, about what other people's experiences are. So, I would say that I still have a little bit of a skeptical streak in me, but I think that's a good thing, and I also think that my progress from that internal, just for myself type of spiritual questioning to being open and talking about it and talking with others. I think that's a path that a lot of people are on right now. And so I look at it as my experience being one that I can share with others, that I can understand where you're at, and I can understand where you may want to go. And so I would say that, and it wasn't a boom, I'm awake kind of thing, but it was a progressive kind of a path.
It sounds to me like it's a path that, well, certainly one that I can empathize with, is that sort of introvert's path of, introspection. And it's all about, spirituality is a very personal thing anyway, isn't it?
It is. And it's funny when you said introvert, because I find I would categorize myself as an introvert. When I was in school taking psychology in college, we did the test, introvert, extrovert. I was high introvert,
Okay.
but and then to be doing now a podcast for so long, it's kind of funny to see the transition.
You have written, amongst the many things that you've done, you've written 3 books. Do you want to tell us broadly about the 3 of them? And then I'd like to talk to a little bit more about perhaps the first one that you wrote.
Okay, sure.
See how it goes.
Oh, that sounds great. The first one was Joy Potential, Where You'd Least Expect It. And that was a book that I first self-published in 2012. And it was a book that was, I would say, 20 years in the making, in the sense that in the 90s, I one of those rare occasions where I would go to an intuitive, it came up that in that particular discussion that I would, in 2012, be publishing a book. And I thought, oh, good, this is great. And of course, I thought, why wait 20 years? Let me go ahead and do that now. And in the interim, I tried several times, multiple times, to write that book. And every single time it came out as like a training manual instead of a book. It was kind of so. And then in 2012, the idea for Joy Potential just popped into my head, and the plot and everything just kind of came to mind. So that was that one. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in detail. But the second one was Spirituality Bites. Or It's No Secret, Spirituality Bites, excuse me. And that one was basically a gathering of things that I had learned in my first 10 years of doing the podcast. And these were things that I had learned from guests that provided me with tools and activities to make my life better, less stressful, more happy, and I really wanted to share it with people, beyond just the podcast. So what I did is I, gathered many of the things that I had learned. Also, at the end of each chapter, I included things that I had done, to implement those kinds of activities, and suggestions for people to do the same if they chose. And then the third one was the Heart and Soul of Caring. And that one came as a waking dream. As I woke up, I had this idea that I should do a caregiver book, and in it, have the first focus be on the care receiver, the person who is receiving the care, and because many times in caregiving situations, we get sidetracked and forget about the individual who we're caring for, who they are, what their essence is. And many times, caregivers are dealing with dementia or Alzheimer's, and the individual person's state of being is really affected. And so we get kind of focused on the care and not so much the individual. So my idea with that one is to gather stories from people that have listened to the show or through my social networking who are caregivers, and have them start their story with the person, describing the essence of the person with whom they provided care, and then the things that they learned, the joys and the challenges of being a caregiver.
We'll come on to the other book in a second, but as you were talking there, I was feeling that there could well be several people amongst the subscriber base of my channel that would be in that caregiving situation. I mean, in that book that you wrote there, were there any absolute sort of kind of nuggets that really struck you as being the sort of thing that you would like to pass on?
Well, the main thing with the caregiver, I guess the things that I took out, first of all, is that it's a challenging kind of role to play, very challenging role to play. And one of the biggest challenges is with, people who receive care, who were strong, independent people, but are now relying on care. So, I mean, it's one of those things where it goes, in essence, it kind of goes against their nature to be receiving care, and that's a tough one. And for many caregivers, like I had one person who was caring for her father, and she did everything, and she just recently passed, but she did everything within her power to make sure she took care of her father at home. And that meant bathing and taking care of all of the bodily types of care needed. And she had spoken to one of her friends about it, who was in a very similar situation, and she said, "Oh, I just couldn't do that. I just cannot do that. I have to have someone else do that." And so in that kind of scenario, it shows me that, like in the first one, that she and she even said herself, in retrospect, that she learned so much about herself through that process. And I would venture to say that the other person learned about themselves as well, as far as the challenges of that. And, without judgment, of one way or the other, it is a role scenario that teaches that empathy and that compassion, that we learn, and it's in a scene that really tests both receiver and giver, and in that sense, it's, I think that is, I guess one of those life lessons, that we go through and we learn more about ourselves. So I think, for those who are going through that caregiving right now, just recognize that it's an opportunity to learn about themselves and learn about the person for whom they're caring, and that either approach, not all approaches are okay. I mean, in the sense that, you do what you can, what you feel comfortable with, but also it teaches you something in the process.
Was that a book that came out of personal experience as well?
Well, it's interesting. Well, actually, there is a personal aspect, but it wasn't really the caregiving aspect. What happened was, my mom had passed a few years before that, and my sister was the caregiver for her in her final days, and I had been estranged from my mother for years, like 15 years, and it was one of those cases, like, oh, but in as I was waking up, I realized that this kind of had to be done for her. It was kind of like one of those things I wanted to do for her. And when I approached my sister about writing a story, she had told me that in my mother's last days, that my sister had constantly asked her to contact me, to kind of, set it straight, so to speak, before she passed on. And she always refused, said it was too late, and then I did not know any of that, at the time. So, but again, it was one of those kinds of things where, when it gets time to caring at the end, in that particular case, it was like, oh, okay, I could have, done, tried to approach, but I had over the years too, from many times. So anyway, that was one of the cases. So I knew that I kind of needed to have that be part of the book, and it was the first story. And interestingly, I was talking to one of my intuitive friends who told me I should write poetry, and I was like, oh, you don't know who you're talking to. You don't know who you're talking to. But I ended up writing a poem, kind of expressing my mother's energy, and had that as part of the book. And it was, after my sister read it, she said it really encapsulated her struggle with, her upbringing, her choices, and her fear, of the unknown and what's going to happen next, and that kind of thing. So in that sense, that was a very personal thing. But I'm very glad that I did that, because I have a sense that it eased the, whatever there is in this, current life, afterlife connection.
Right. Yeah. I think by the sounds of it, it was quite a cathartic thing for both of you, I think.
Exactly. Good word.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first book you wrote was Joy Potential, Where You Least Expect It. Joy Potential, Where You Least Expect It. Yeah. So tell us about that. Is that a novel, or is that what is that? What is that? Tell us about that.
Well, it's funny. The perfect description of it was from a guest that I had from Australia who wrote a book. And he called his book Faction. It's facts based in a fictional kind of story. So in the Joy Potential. Now, again, when I was doing Joy Potential, I did it, that idea came to my mind. And when I got back from, I usually walk every morning, do my little nature, grounding kind of thing every morning. And when I got back from the walk, it was like, oh God, I got this wonderful plot. Let me go ahead and write it. And then I would write down kind of what popped into my head. And then I would kind of try to go beyond, what I had, to build the story. And nothing came until I walked the next day.
Right.
And it was crazy. I would walk, and then all of a sudden, a particular character would come to mind and what they would do and say. And so each day I would walk and I would find out what I was to write, and I would write it. And actually, even and so the idea of building a character, setting out the plot, and all those kinds of things, I did it backwards, in the sense that I just kind of, the story unfolded as I walked and wrote. And then there were a couple lessons that I really wanted to include in the idea of the idea of joy potential, that I wanted to make sure to include in that. So it was one of those cases where it was write as you walk kind of aspect.
That sounds great. I mean, talking about a sort of a walking meditation or an inspirational, process. That's fantastic. And joy as a subject then is, it seems quite often that in the world today, many people are having trouble finding joy. Do you have a kind of a view on that? Is that sort of reflected
Yeah,
in the book?
yeah, it is. Now, joy. There's joy, and then there's happiness. Now, joy, I view joy as being um, kind of a over overwhelming kind of sense of peace and happiness. So I mean, happiness is one of those where haha, I'm feeling good. Joy includes that sense, happiness, but also includes that sense of peace. And the one thing that when I put where joy potential, first of all, is the idea is that every day we have hundreds, if not thousands, of opportunities to create joy, to create that happiness, or to create that sense of peace, within our days. If we recognize it and kind of bring it in to ourselves. Now, where you least expected, that kind of popped up because as I was going through and writing the book, I recognized that there were, many of the characters that brought the main character joy were not people that you would have thought that would have been a source of joy. And so the idea, what I really wanted for folks to gather after reading the book was that to recognize in their day that they have this opportunity. It's up to them to choose what they do with it, but the fact is, and also to broaden their idea of where joy can come from, or what, who, types of people or types of situations that can be the source of joy.
That's a really nice point, though, isn't it? We can be so often, restricted by our conditioning as to what we expect in a day in our lives. But it sounds to me like you really pulled that open.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. The book has, first of all, the book was written in the first person, and I never identify whether the person is male or female, or even the name of the person, because I wanted the reader to put themselves into that, so that, like, when the character says, I can't find, any good thing in this, taking this third shift job, there's nothing there for me, and to open up to, and to recognize that, maybe someone who is going through that, a tough job situation, in the book, it ends up being a blessing, or a huge blessing, for the individual. So that, so if someone is going through that, or someone is going through the idea of feeling that they're a failure, or feeling that some of the things that they have done haven't been successful enough, to recognize that, success can come in very different ways. Um, and I had a recent example of that. I mentioned that one of my podcast friends had just recently passed. I did a podcast as a tribute to her, and she had many followers. And I thought, there's going to be a lot of people, and online there were people that were posting things, tribute to her. So I expected, there to be a healthy number of folks. Only one person called in.
Oh,
The
wow.
whole, it was supposed to go for 2 hours, and it only lasted for 1 hour.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh Lord. Um, but out of that, what was interesting was there was one of her followers, a woman. Her name was Jeanette. Said that she had written a poem for our friend, and our friend was also a poet. She also wrote many poems and contributed a lot of poems. So I thought, that's wonderful. And she sent me the poem and said, would this be appropriate, to share? And it was beautiful. It was very beautiful. And I said, yes, it would. But it would be better in your voice, because she wanted me to read it. She wouldn't
Mm,
feel comfortable talking, and I understood that.
mm,
But she I told her, I said, it would really kind of be better for your voice. Well, she ended up creating an audio of her voice reading it, and I shared that on the show. But her voice was awesome. I mean, and the day before all of this transpired, I had a woman on as a guest from Moscow who was talked about the importance of voice and women claiming their voice. So, I mean, when she said that she didn't want to, it was like, oh, let me tell you, yesterday, So, and then afterwards, after the show, she wrote back to me and said, that several of Corey's friends really liked the poem, wanted to get a copy of her reading of it, and wanted her also to share. So it was, and I just thought, well, that was it. That was the whole reason for this, is for her to show her voice, to claim that power, and in a way that Corrine would have loved very much to have happened. So that was one of those things where, my expectations really didn't count, but, and that short-lived, sense of disappointment was quickly replaced by recognizing that there was a bigger purpose to that.
that's a lovely story. Absolutely lovely in exactly that, in summarizing that, and the aspect of opportunity in things. It's coming back to that, looking at life with different eyes, or as quite a well-known channel tends to say, is things being re-seen in a different view. And you have some kind of thoughts around similar things. In day-to-day life, we might miss opportunity, or think we miss opportunity, or discover, I suppose, surprise and opportunity in all sorts of things.
Yeah, and actually, the missed opportunity aspect was one in Joy Potential that I had to add in. I mean, I had gotten to a point where I was probably about three-quarters of the way through writing the book, and what happened is probably in a period of a week, I had several people or several publicists or people come to me to, you know, be a guest on the show, the podcast. And I said, sure, looking at what they had, sure, sure. And then never heard back. Never heard back from them. And I just thought, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. Saying people, could choose first. Why do you ask if you didn't
Yeah.
want to? And then it was at that point I thought, how many times, do are we presented with opportunities, but we don't follow through with them, or even like there was one of my very early shows. I had a woman who had asked to be on the show, and she wrote a book about how being married to a sociopath led to her spiritual path. And
Right.
I was like, whoa, okay. And at that point, I wasn't really sure if this was one of those I really want to ask. I was like, oh Lord, what am I getting myself into? But it was one of those again. It was kind of shortly after that. I thought, this is an opportunity. It's just go with it, see what happens. And she went on, shared her story, shared her website with all of its resources. And it was probably the most responded to podcast that I have done, in the sense that the women were so thankful, that, and I had no idea that there were that many women married to sociopaths, but apparently there are. The idea of kind of regret of opportunities, of missed opportunities. I look at that in a couple of ways. One is that it provided, like for me, it provided me with an opportunity to go beyond my comfort zone. That there was maybe a fear of the unknown. How would I do? How would it be responded to? Those kinds of things that prevented me from taking advantage of some. Now, if I were to learn from that, the next time that something like that happened, I would, maybe think twice, or maybe not respond quickly, give myself some time to think about it, which is how I incorporated that into my programming. Is that if there's something that initially my first response is, no. Now, I don't usually go on my show into sex and politics. Those are a couple of areas I just, there's so much division. I would rather be cohesive. So, but when something like that comes up, I do take a break and recognize that, I ask myself, what's my uncomfort here? Why am I uncomfortable? Why don't I want to do this? Last time, I understood, and do I still feel uncomfortable with this? Or is there something that maybe like that sociopath merits that would be for the greater good? And that, I can just, maybe ease my discomfort by going through a conversation. And then there's always the chance that I don't learn from it, and I would continue to miss more opportunities. And, I think that the more opportunities we're presented and we take, the more are presented. The more that we are presented and we don't take, the fewer that are presented.
The other thing that you're really keen on, just to wrap up, really, it's been lovely to talk to you, but the other thing that you're keen on is photography.
Yes, sir. That's something that I was, as a child, I was interested in photography, and would drive my mother crazy with, buying film and the processing of film, and also having pictures that were not worth the printing. But then, it went dormant for a long period of time. I did take one photography class in college, as one of those easy kinds of courses to take, and really enjoyed the whole darkroom experience and that kind of thing. And then probably in about 2012, right around then, is I really got into taking photos, and upgraded my camera, and with the advent of digital, you can take as many pictures as you want without having to go through the processing of it. And then our topics, I ended up really focusing on nature. To me, nature is one of those areas that people can identify with. It has a lot to teach us, and so I really enjoy taking nature photographs.
That's lovely. You have actually got some lovely pictures. I did have a look through your picture website, and I'll pop it in the links beneath this interview as well.
Thank you.
Robert, fantastic. Lovely to have spent some time with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. This has really been fun. I enjoyed it.
It's great. It's a real joy to meet you.